Okay, why don't we kick it off and make a start? Once again, very good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar. We will be discussing this topic of conflict management. So the idea is to speak a little bit about conflict management, about what it entails, how to become successful conflict managers, how to resolve conflict in our life, professionally and personally, and a few tools and skills and competencies in that regard. And this is a continuation of other webinars we've had about 21st century skills. It builds on quite a few of the same skills. And we have, I think, two more webinars after this the rest of the year. We will start again in 2024. Can you believe that that is almost the end of 2023? Seems like this is the type of thing that shouldn't surprise us, that the year goes so quickly, but it seems like continues to be surprising. For by way of introduction, I see I'm having some connection issues. I hope that you're hearing me okay. My name is James Sturdee. Just for those of you who are new to this webinar series and haven't worked with me before, I'm a registered psychological counselor. I am in private practice at Durban. I also consult for Region Business School. And I provide counseling as well as workshops to students and staff of Region. So if you are interested in setting up a counseling session, whether it be for career counseling or any type of psychological counseling and going on in your personal life, you're welcome to email me. You can email me at counseling@region.ac.za. I'm going to put that in the chat so it is there. There's a comma in there that's meant to be a full stop, but you guys will be able to resolve that, I'm sure. Okay, so let us get into it. For those of you who have been in these webinars before, you will know that I like to keep an eye on the chat as we go. So if there are any comments as we're going through this, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to pay attention to that, and if they are relevant, to engage with it. There will also be time for Q&A at the end of the session. We have an hour block for this. It will probably be slightly less of that, and there'll be time for Q&A. So if you have any questions that are coming up during the course of this webinar, do either make a note of them or put them in the chat. If I don't get a chance to address them in during the content of the webinar, we can speak about them, address them. Yeah. Good. So I see more people are coming in. We have a good number. Let us get going. Let's speak a little bit about conflict. What do you think when you think about this idea of conflict and conflict management? What is the first association that comes to your mind? Tell me a bit about that. You can put it in the chat. What do you think of? What's the first feeling you have when you think about this concept of conflict? Is it a good or a bad association? Do you feel like, well, this is really okay, Julie, yeah, I'm just seeing your comment. Thank you so much. People not seeing one another's perspectives or carrying each other out. That is what you think of when you think of conflict. Yeah, that's helpful. Anybody else? Arbitration and contracts from Yvonne. That's also interesting. Yeah, that sounds like it's coming from a labor relations, industrial relations background there. And my background, as I'm sure you can imagine, is less in the labor mediation and more in interpersonal, psychological mediation. I do a lot of relationship counseling in my practice, and conflict is a big part of that as well. Do you think it is good or bad? If we were to think about it in kind of simplistic terms, do you when you imagine this idea of conflict, do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad? What is your immediate association? Would you like to have more or less conflict in your life? It's another way of asking the question. So, Julie, you're saying both. It can be positive to challenge ideas. Indeed, it can be. How do you feel about conflict in your lives, though? Would you like more of it, less of it? Most people, when they think about conflict, they have the same reaction that you do, Julie, which is just not particularly enjoyable. tend to try avoid it. That's exactly right. I think we all recognize to some extent that conflict comes with the territory of relationships, but at the same time, a lot of people will say, "I don't like conflict." That is a very, very normal human reaction to have. And what happens, we often start to associate it with negativity. We start to think, well, conflict is a bad thing, which means I need to avoid it in my life, in my relationships, as much as possible. So, and Paul, what you're saying there is it's good because it's an opportunity to resolve the problem. That's absolutely right. However, we can think about that perhaps in a theoretical framework. We can say, yes, conflict is good. It helps us to resolve things. But often we are afraid of it. And I think we're afraid of it because it can feel scary, it can feel messy, it can feel unpredictable. We're not sure what will happen when we get into a conflict situation. And we can fear certain things, right? We can fear judgment or rejection. We can fear, what are people going to think about me if I say this? What happens if I say something I don't regret? What happens if I break something in this relationship? These are often the thoughts we have that are associated with conflict. Let's speak a bit more about what it actually is. So it's essentially just a differing in two different positions. So that's a fairly neutral definition. That's not putting any type of judgment on whether it's good or bad. Really, it's just when two different values, perspectives, or opinions are not in alignment and they come together. As I said, that's neutral. It doesn't necessarily mean that conflict becomes fight. And we often use these words interchangeably. We think about conflict as a fight. And if you think about it that way, and your association immediately is conflict is negative, conflict is a fight, conflict is destructive. What that means is you're more likely to want to avoid it. You're more likely to think this is a negative presence in my life. I don't want to experience it. I want to do what I can to avoid it. And that will often mean suppressing your voice, or often mean not putting your boundaries up, or mean perhaps being less assertive, or seeing conflict coming and running away from it, just trying to keep the peace. But again, with this kind of straightforward definition, it's not necessarily inherently about any type of warfare between two people necessarily, but more just about two differing perspectives or beliefs and opinions. And these, people are different, of course. There are no two people that are completely the same. So even someone who we share a lot of our values with, even someone, perhaps a romantic partner who we've decided to spend our life with, we're still going to have different ideas and perspectives and priorities and preferences, different beliefs, values, goals. And even though the underlying values might often be quite similar, we are going to butt heads on other things. This is typically how conflict starts to arise. And normally, it's the longer you spend with people, the more likely you are going to find that there are going to be things that come into conflict. Yeah. So I'm just reading Linda's comment. It's good you have the right to have your own opinion. I think that's absolutely right. But having your own opinion is one thing. Sharing your other opinion when the stakes can feel quite high can be quite a scary thing as well. And often, what people will do is they will not share their opinion because what is someone going to think of if I say this? What are they going to think of me if I say something that is in disagreement? How personally will they take it? Will they think that it's a judgment on them? And so the path of least resistance, the safer option to avoid conflict. We characterize it as negative, and because of that, and this often has to do with our early experiences of conflict as well. This is a theme that would have come up in our other workshops as well, is that so many of these life skills and competencies and tools that we use to deal with people, so much of our perspectives they have deep roots in our early experiences and our early relationships. So the way we think about conflict is no different to the way we're able to set our boundaries, to communicate, regulate our feelings, to be emotionally intelligent or not. This is all, a lot of that comes from the early experiences that we have that are formative, that are instructive about the beliefs we have about the world, and the beliefs we have about people, generally speaking. So you can think about someone perhaps who grows up in a household where there is a lot of conflict. And sometimes a helpful way to differentiate conflict is destructive versus constructive. So we can have destructive conflict, which is just people attacking each other. Sometimes that would mean physically attacking each other, but more often it'll be verbally attacking. You're such a bad person, you're an idiot, or you never do anything right. Really personal attacks. That's destructive conflict. It's really about the person. it's not about resolving whatever misunderstanding or misalignment of ideas, perspectives are there. It's more about winning. So it's a win-lose dynamic. And another really powerful dynamic in conflict is we get caught into this. Well, I need to win, I can't seem to lose, and so our pride comes into it. So someone who grows up in that type of environment where there's more destructive conflict as opposed to constructive conflict, they're more likely to develop associations with conflict that are not positive. They're going to have these associations that say, well, conflict is a really, really painful experience. I just think about how my parents used to speak to each other and how damaging that was to them, to their relationship. They ended up getting divorced. That split up our family. If there had been no conflict, then the relationship would have been better. So what I want to do when I grow up is I want to be in a relationship where there is no conflict. I want to be in a relationship where everything is peaceful because I don't want to follow the same route that they did. That's a very understandable consequence of someone who's exposed to destructive conflict. And the other layer to that is that someone who's exposed to destructive conflict doesn't get to see constructive conflict modeled. They get to see destructive conflict modeled, which is to say they never really get the ability to learn through observation of how to handle conflict in a healthy way. And so when they find themselves getting into conflict situations, which are inevitable as they kind of grow up and develop themselves in the world, start to bump into the people around them, they draw on what they know, which is often destructive tendencies. And that's to, explode and to use anger in unhelpful ways, to attack, to become defensive, to stonewall, to criticize, all of these techniques around destructive conflict. And then they see themselves doing that, and it reminds them of their, let's say, parents who used to do those things. And they think, well, this is so terrible. This is just proof again how bad conflict is. And that becomes another reason to try to avoid conflict more. As opposed to someone who grows up exposed to a little bit more constructive conflict, which is to say they're not exposed to all of the terrible fights that their parents are having, but they also at times see that their parents disagree, or their caregivers or people in the family, however the culture of the family is allows conflict to happen. And they see these disagreements happen, and they see them happening in a culture of kindness and a culture of respect. Even though there might be feelings such as disappointment and anger associated, they still see kindness and respect, and they see mechanisms to resolve conflict within those cultural constraints. And then they're going to grow up and thinking, well, maybe conflict isn't so bad, as much as it might make me uncomfortable, it might be a little bit anxiety provoking. I also recognize how valuable it can be because I've seen that. And so they're more likely to imagine a relationship where there is conflict at times, not constant unhelpful conflict, but when necessary to deal with the problems. And then again, this becomes reinforcing because someone who does that is more likely then to draw on what they've seen modeled. Again, there are observed lessons, and they're going to incorporate that into their conflict settings, and then that'll build back their belief, that'll feed back into their belief that actually I can handle conflict the way I am able to do this. So you can see how these lines can kind of divert in two very basic pathways. And obviously, human beings are complex, families are complex, and there's a whole lot of different influences that are going to be there. But these are two very clear pathways that can happen. And again, these skills regarding conflict management are learned in those early years a lot of the time. And the beliefs we have about conflict are learned in those early years. But neither of those two things are fixed and set. So just because we might learn how to think about conflict and learn how to act in conflict in the early years of our lives, doesn't mean that that's how we have to think about it, and that's how we have to kind of be limited in our skill set for the rest of our life. These are things that are really, really responsive to coaching and training and practice and becoming more skillful at these things. When we recognize that conflict is inevitable, when we recognize that it's actually unavoidable, that there will be times where we start to butt heads with someone or disagree with someone or have an opinion that is opposed to someone else, when we realize that part of being in a human relationship is at times seeing the world differently, thinking about the world differently, having a different idea of how things must be done. Again, in family unit with your spouse, perhaps you have very shared values, but at the same time, you might disagree about how to raise your kids in certain aspects, you might disagree about financial choices. The inevitability of that then it puts us in a position where we are then forced to say, okay, well, if this thing is inevitable, does it make sense for me to be fighting it, to be fighting the conflict or resisting the conflict? Or does it make sense for me to become better at this, to avoid the unavoidable conflict, to know when to pick my battles, but also to have the skills to be able to go into a conflict situation and express myself, to use my voice to try resolve it, to use some high performance skills there, because this is something that's not going away. And if I'm able to, our relationships a lot of the time are functions of the investment that we put into it. So if we're investing in a relationship with destructive conflicts, every time I get angry, I'm just going to call you names. And I'll apologize afterwards. Sure, I'll apologize and say that was terrible of me. I never should have done it. But the next time I do it again, my relationship, the quality of that relationship is going to resemble that over time. Whether it's a professional relationship, or whether it's a personal relationship, friendship, whether it's a relationship with a girlfriend, a boyfriend, husband, wife, the quality of that relationship is going to over time reflect how I am at my worst in that relationship. So being at my best is important, but at times I'm going to be at my worst. How I show up when I'm at my worst is going to then determine the quality of how good that relationship can be. And often there aren't immediate consequences for being the worst versions of ourselves in a relationship. Our partners, especially in a marriage, our partners aren't necessarily going to leave us every time we're unkind or a little bit cruel. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be there's not going to be returns on those investments. And likewise, if we're able to really invest in quality conflict management and resolution in our relationships are then going to reflect that as well. And we can't control how another person shows up in conflict situations. That's outside of our control. And we can't take responsibility for how another person manages conflict. But we can introduce healthy dynamics and allow them to be the best versions of themselves. Because often what will happen is when we're dealing with difficult people or maybe toxic people, we'll say, they're just so toxic, there's nothing I can do. But by it can become a race to the bottom. If we respond in toxic ways, we're never giving that the opportunity to change, become a healthier conflict setting, conflict situation. Whereas if we're introducing healthier conflict management, what that can do is at least it gives them the opportunity to meet us there. They might or might not do it. And part of being able to have boundaries is protecting ourselves if they choose not to come along on that journey. Okay, so in terms of conflict management styles, there are five main buckets that you could put a person in terms of how they manage conflict. And this is quite a helpful way of thinking about it. And I'd encourage you to think about your own style that you use as I go through this. Essentially, a person won't just use one, will often use a couple of different ones depending on the situation, depending on the relationship. It all is context based, but it's not to say we have one style of conflict we use that in every single relationship. Often people will treat the people closest to them terribly. They will be really aggressive and not very mindful and intentional. They'll say whatever they want, but then with people who aren't as close to them and maybe people who they care more what they think, then they'll be very appeasing, people pleasing. The people can kind of move between one and the other. But it's helpful just to think, well, what do I go to in most relationships? What is my kind of fallback conflict management style? How well is it serving me? You can think about it on these axes, X and Y axes here in this graph, to think about what it looks like. So there's cooperation versus competitiveness. Another way of putting this is it's about the needs of ourselves. So what are my needs and what are the needs of the relationship? So my needs are the competitiveness. How much do I compete for what it is that I want? And how much do I favor the needs of the relationship? And this is one framework thinking about conflict. Is I either am very much focused on the needs of the relationship. So I want the relationship to be good and peaceful and happy, and I never want there to be any boat rocking. I want everything to be smooth. That would mean I'm really favoring cooperation. I'm favoring the relationship, and probably at times neglecting my own needs. Or on the other end of that, I'm very focused on my own needs and I don't care what the relationship looks like. Again, in terms of the investments I was talking about earlier, I don't care if my relationship suffers. When I want something, I will say it and I will get it. Okay. So 5 different places. If you are very low on cooperation and very low on competitiveness, again, that's to say you're not really looking to advocate for yourself and for your own needs, but you're also not really going to invest in the relationship because that's also something that just feels beyond you. That's the avoidant conflict management style. So something comes up, you realize you don't like it, you don't say anything, you don't kind of go out to meet the other person where they are, but you also don't advocate for your own needs. You'd rather just steer well clear of the conflict completely. That's the avoidance technique, and that's kind of like the ostrich with the head in the sand, or the tortoise who goes into their shell. Which one goes into their shell? Tortoise, turtles. Turtles don't go to their shells. The one who hides away. You get the animal analogy. So that's avoidance. And a person who's avoidant is not going to have their needs met. People are not going to understand what it is that they want in relationships, which means that is the most certain way to make sure that your needs are not met in any relationship. Don't say what the needs are. Expect or assume another person will know what they are. That is the most likely way you will be in a relationship with your needs are. But likely the person who's avoidant, so they're not investing in themselves, but they're also not investing in relationships. Their relationships are low quality, and their own emotional needs are not fulfilled. That's the very likely consequence of an avoidance technique. If you're very high on cooperating, which is the needs of the relationship, you're very focused on the other person, their needs, making sure they're happy, and not advocating for yourself, then you are accommodating. This is often described as the teddy bear. So everyone likes the person who's accommodating. This is, I'm sure as I'm speaking about it, you're kind of thinking, yeah, this sounds a bit like me. This is a very common conflict management style because it's very safe. You're focusing on other people. You're making other people happy. People love you, but people aren't really taking your needs into account. And again, that's because of this dynamic of low interest in your own needs, not really having the skills or the belief or the feeling like you are deserving of even being able to say what it is that you need. So that's accommodating. That type of person typically has good relationships. People like them, but they're often also quite low quality relationships because there's not a lot of real understanding and connection there because there's not a lot of vulnerability, not a lot of trust. It's often a very one-way relationship. So you can come to me and tell me all about your needs, but I'm never really going to be honest with you. I'm never really going to tell you what I'm really thinking because that might jeopardize the relationship. That's the accommodating style. If you are very focused on your own needs and very much neglectful of the needs of the relationships, when you're in a conflict situation, you steamroll, you bulldoze. That's the more aggressive conflict management style. It's very competitive. That's very high in competitiveness, very low in cooperation. That type of person gets what they want. So people know what they want. They're very rarely in any doubt about what a competitive person needs. But their relationships are often low quality for the reason that people are more fearful than respectful of them. They will often get what they want, but people will often just avoid them or start to withdraw from relationships with them. The person who's very competitive is probably going to have to find someone who's very accommodating. In the middle, as you start to go up both of these to find some type of balance there. If you're somewhere in terms of meeting your own needs, not completely, but you are able to say, this is what I want. And you are also going to be able to take into account the needs of the other person in a cooperative way to focus on the relationship. That's the compromising style. And it can be very helpful. It's very necessary in relationships, especially long-term relationships. Compromise, of course, you all know this. It's so important. A relationship can't really survive in any meaningful way. A fair relationship can't survive in any meaningful way unless there's not compromise at time. But we often confuse ourselves about this. We often give up and tell ourselves that we're compromising when in fact we're actually sacrificing. So compromise is when we're both giving up something to find some ground. It's not perfect, right? It's a deal. Okay, fine. I'm not going to go out Thursday nights, but then we'll go out together on Saturday. I really wanted to kind of come to this function of yours. I can't do it, but I will meet you another time. So you're kind of giving up something in order to gain something. It's that middle ground. It's helpful. It's healthy. But it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all. There are times when compromise is not helpful and healthy. Sometimes it's not. There are things that we shouldn't be sacrificing, compromising on. The high the high competency, high level conflict management style is one that is collaborating. So collaborating is when you are very mindful and cognizant of your own needs and you're able to advocate those in a very clear way, but you're also very aware of the relationship and what that relationship means to you, whatever that might be. Different relationships mean different things to us that can be invested in different ways, but we're able to balance this these competing needs here of my own needs and the needs of the relationship. And we do that through really advanced competencies like active listening and being able to really communicate authentically, to be vulnerable as well, to be able to say, well, this is what's going on, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I need, this is how I felt, this is how I think you're acting, in a very highly emotionally intelligent ways. That allows collaboration to happen. So as I said, you will find yourself at different times using different styles, and in many ways that's healthy. It's, with most soft skills, life skills, it's helpful to have many tools in our toolbox to be able to have the ability to choose different options. It's often when we don't have the ability and we can't default to one specific way of doing something that's problematic, because then we don't have any diversity and we can't react hopefully to a situation, because we're always locked into, well, when I'm in conflict I withdraw, or when I'm in conflict I become really dominant. To have different types of styles that we can draw on based on what the specific context of that conflict is really helpful, because there are times where it's good to be very highly competitive, where maybe in a negotiation or raise perhaps, maybe if you don't do that you're not going to get your needs met. Maybe it's maybe in the case of an emergency and you just have to say, actually, this is something, it doesn't matter what happens to this relationship, I need to, this is something that I really need. At the same time, avoidance can be really helpful. Often avoiding unnecessary conflict, road rage, for example. If we're able to be avoidant and say, well, this person has really annoyed me, they've cut me off, they've been really in the wrong, but I'm letting it go because it's not worth it. I'm not going to advocate for myself. I'm not going to try to teach them a lesson. I'm going to move away from it. That's helpful in that specific context. And likewise, being accommodating. If we were in touch enough with our own needs, we can say, I don't actually need this thing right now. I'm big enough to give it up. You can have it. If that was the only thing that we always did, of course, that would go back to some of those consequences that we'd see in our relationships that wouldn't be very healthy. But if at times we're able to say, you know what, I will sacrifice this. I'm actually well aware that I can do this. I'm not going to hold on to it just for power and struggle. You can have whatever it is that you're asking. I'm going to give it up. I'm doing that choicefully. I'm doing it very mindfully. Okay. So there are these reinforcing spirals that can happen when we're able to bring healthy, constructive conflict management into environments and into relationships, and they kind of go around in these feedback loops. So if you look at this one here, spotting potential conflict, you can start anywhere, but if you were to start, spotting potential conflict sees not waiting until something happens and then reacting to it, but rather being able to be mindful enough of the dynamics there and say, hang on, I can see something's coming. You come late twice, or you've arrived late twice in this week. It's not a problem yet, but I could see if this was to continue, that would be a problem. So let's have a conversation about it now. If you're able to bring those out into the open, what that means is that spotting potential conflict then allows you to talk more about win-win solutions. This is a collaborative approach, right? It's not making conflict a zero-sum game, which is, if I win, it means that you will lose, or if I'm going to get something, you're going to have to give something up. To be able to then orchestrate the win-win solutions, because if you're doing it before the conflict blows up, or before everyone kind of starts to bring their unhappiness to the table because things have happened, if you do it before then in a preemptive way, you're more likely to find people are more willing to negotiate and to not be defensive. And this then creates a culture where there is more open discussion, open debate, because we're not all just keeping everything inside. That's not part of this relationship. I know I can trust you. If you're not happy, you're going to say something. That's encouraging this open debate. And then when the disagreements are out in the open, you have the opportunity then to resolve them in healthy ways, as opposed to when they are down below and they become resentment and they start to come out in different ways. This is often what you'll see in relationships, and I see it a lot in my couples counseling, is the fights that they will bring to the session will be really minuscule. It'll be about who left the Volvo out the counter, but it's never about that. Of course, it's about these disagreements that are deep down there, these dynamics that are not being talked about. I feel like I'm the one who does everything in this relationship. I feel like you don't appreciate me. The one time I ask you to do something, you don't do it. That's what these underlying dynamics are. And so being able to bring them out of the open then allows you to have honest conversations about them, and that's the only way that we're able to resolve these things. Okay, so a few conflict resolution strategies. Some of these you'll be aware of, some of them you would have forgotten, some might be new, but it's helpful just to mindfully think about what are the strategies that we can use to resolve conflict in a healthy way. Staying calm, of course, is easier said than done. This goes without saying. This goes back to emotional intelligence as well, to understand that it is part of being human to have feelings in conflict situations. Again, depending on what the conflict is, we're going to have different feelings based on this, but often conflict is an emotional experience. And with that emotional experience, we can have these adrenalized responses, right? We can find this stress response, fight or flight response being triggered, being activated. Or we can find these amygdala hijacked because we are reminded of previous things that have happened to us in this conflict situation. So a certain tone of voice that my wife will use, and it reminds me of how my mom used to discipline me, and all of a sudden my hackles rise and I'm responding in a really disproportionate, irrational way. These are normal human experiences to have, and the ability to bring ourselves back to be calm, to be grounded, to use any type of techniques we can use in terms of deep breathing, visualization, relaxation techniques, to let the intellectual parts of our brain catch up, the logical parts of our brain catch up, and to be able to challenge that. So, okay, well, it feels a certain way, it doesn't mean it's a certain way. How do I then bring the calmness back? And when we're able to do this, we're able to, this is the emotionally intelligent approach, we're able to hear our feelings and acknowledge them and listen to them, but they're not necessarily calling the shots. So they're there, they're part of the consultation, but our executive functioning, the rational parts of our brain, gets to channel those feelings into the words we use and the way we act in these conflict situations. When we're just acting emotionally, then we're going to be bringing all sorts of things into the conflict, and we're going to trigger defensiveness because human beings are, we're emotional animals, which means we're also attuned to other people's emotions. And if someone comes in this kind of raw anger, we're going to automatically respond in ways to protect ourselves. And that might be aggression back, or it might be withdrawal, it might be defensiveness, it might be shutting down, freezing. So by staying calm, we take the likelihood of introducing those dynamics into conflict out of the equation. Listening to understand, this is active listening 101, which is to say most of the time in conflict, what we're not doing is listening to understand. We're waiting so we can have our say. Or we're kind of, we're approaching it in a very legalistic way. So I'm listening very closely to the actual words that you use. And if you say the wrong word, then I'm going to hold you to that. So I'm never going to allow you to take it back. I'm never going to allow you to correct the record and say, oh, I actually mean that. I'm not going to listen for meaning. I'm going to legalistically listen to your words, and then I'm going to use that against you. That's a weapon I can use in a relationship, in a conflict. That is very destructive, of course. Listening to understand means there's a couple of advantages to it. Firstly, if someone knows that you're really trying to understand them, that's going to make it's going to reassure them that you're entering that conflict in goodwill. It's going to make them less likely to try use their own weapons to bash you over the head to get you to understand. And they're not going to, people will resort to things like shaming to try get you to see where they're coming from or imagine what they're feeling or kind of validate their feelings. If they really feel that you're listening and you're trying to understand them, then they're less likely to use those. Also means you can start to understand, well, what does this person actually want from us? What's really going on there? And then I can talk about that. Well, let's bring that out. I hear you saying this. I think that you want this thing. Is that right? You seem upset about this. You seem like you're feeling disappointed about this. Is it because I did that? And how can I be different? How can I meet your needs? And then if they're able to communicate that, you're able to say, well, yes, I can, or I can't. And say, well, actually, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're asking for. I'm unable to give you that thing for these reasons. So it cuts out a lot of the unnecessary misunderstanding. Not all conflict is misunderstanding, but a lot of it is either fueled by misunderstanding or a result of direct. Accentuating the positive. This is not just finding the negativity in what the person's saying as well. I'm disappointed that you feel that way, but I'm really glad that you felt comfortable enough to bring it to my attention. That really makes me feel trusted. It makes me feel like this is a relationship that matters to you, and I'm going to try and meet you where I can meet you based on that. I appreciate, I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, but I really like I appreciate the way you're saying it to me. I really feel respected and heard, and thank you for that. You can find the positives in these situations. What you're doing is you're bringing goodwill back into what is often a pretty tense interaction. And if you bring goodwill back in, however you choose to do it, then you are increasing the likelihood that within that context of goodwill, we can find some type of resolution. Yeah, we can collaborate on finding an outcome, which is you want something and I want something, and let's find a way of resolving that as best we can. Tact is just using our words in a way that's considerate to another person. Tact, the point of tactfulness and using tact is not to say we hide what we're saying, or we dance around, or we're indirect, we kind of say something, mean something else. You can be tactful and be very honest, but it's also just about taking into consideration how is this going to be received, and doing it in ways that are respectful and considerate of another person. This is conflict management 101, is attacking the problem, not the person. So deal with the behavior, not the person. This is a very helpful technique. We often overlook it in conflict situations. It's so important to just say, this is not about you as a person. I don't hate you as a person, but this thing that you did, I find that hurtful for this reason, or I didn't like that. Crazy about you, I just didn't like that thing that you did. This allows someone to hear that without feeling like it's personal. You can't stop another person from taking something personally, even if you are using your words very carefully. But again, you can increase the likelihood that they're going to hear it in a way that they're actually going to hear what you're saying. Blame is a really unhelpful practice, typically speaking. Responsibility is a much more constructive tool to use to speak about responsibility. So who's responsible for what? No one's to blame here, but everyone has responsibility. So I'm not responsible for this, but I am responsible for that, and I'll take full responsibility for that. We can only take responsibility for what's in our control, and another person can only take responsibility for what's in their control. As soon as we're talking about blame, then we are shifting responsibility, and we're kind of putting it on another person, or we're throwing someone else under the bus. And that introduces all sorts of unhealthy dynamics to the conflict. Things, and that's going to make people more defensive. It's not introducing goodwill. It's not good faith. People are going to become more unlikely to want to work with you to resolve what it needs to be resolved. The past matters. So when you're focusing on the future, it's not to say that we never talk about the past, especially if significant things have happened in the past. The past is relevant. But we also have to be mindful about how much we can do about the past. Often people get stuck in the past, especially in relationships, for a number of reasons. They might feel that the wounds that were caused in the past are not being acknowledged. If we feel like they're not being acknowledged, or that if I feel like you don't understand how much you hurt me, that makes it very hard for me to forgive. It makes it hard for me to move on, and it also makes me think it might happen again in the future. So that's often the dynamic that brings the past in, and that's important as well. And that also is a bit of a guide for how to ask for forgiveness as well, as acknowledging the hurt that we caused. Because if we acknowledge that hurt, it turns it around, right? People are able to say, okay, well, I see you get it. You understand what it was like. You're compassionate, you're empathetic, and that makes me think that you're probably going to be more careful in the future, which makes me more likely to forgive you. But at the same time, we can't get completely stuck in the past, because the past often becomes a weapon as well. It becomes this thing that you've done, and I can now use that against you for days eternal. You've done this thing that happened in the past, and now it's given me power, and I can use that I can weaponize that. That's not helpful. The Socratic method is asking the right kind of questions. So people often try pigeonhole in conflict situations. Again, it becomes legalistic. We ask questions like a prosecutor might, questions that we know the answers to. We're asking to kind of set someone up in a hole. Did you or did you not say this? What were you thinking when you did this thing? Did you tell me this? Or whatever it might be, questions that we know the answer to, that we're just getting someone to respond to get them on the record so we can hit them with the next question. Gotcha. That's really unhelpful. But at the same time, it is helpful to be able to ask questions, but those questions should be in the context and the aim of trying to understand. So, what did you mean by that? What were your goals when you were doing this? It seemed like this behavior that you did was really out of character for you. I don't really understand. Talk me a bit more about what you're thinking. So, picking your battles is a very important part of conflict, as well as knowing that if we never advocate for ourselves, our relationships will reflect that in healthy ways, and we will start to become resentful. And then eventually, when we do act out, we're either just going to completely cut the person out of our life, or we're going to act in a very aggressive way. But at the same time, if every little thing becomes something that we feel we have to say something about, well, that wears down the relationship as well, and becomes tiresome to be in the receiving end of that. And often we are making all of the little things big things because we're not dealing with the big things. So we're fighting in the small places as opposed to letting the small things go and actually dealing with the big things, the big dynamics in the relationship that need talking about. And when we're dealing with the small things, it often feels safer to shout at you about your not picking up your shoes than actually to speak more about how I feel sometimes in this relationship, for example. Linking offers, this is about compromise as well. So this is the kind of skilled negotiator who's able to bring all these different things together to say, okay, you want this from me, I can't give you that, but can I offer you this? Or you seem to be okay compromising on this. I'm okay to compromise on that. Can we find some middle ground on these specific things? What can I do to make this work? These are really helpful strategies, and this you could use those in relationships, whatever type of relationships, but also in professional settings to be able to just understand the best way we can resolve conflicts a lot of the time is really having a deep understanding of what do we need and what does the other person, and then how do we link that all together. And this will involve creativity as well as thinking outside the box, not getting stuck in the same way of doing things with dancing and danced with this person forever. Being able to say, well, let's do something different, or let's try another way of resolving this. Would you be open to this? I mean, it's crazy, but what about this, for example? And confidence. So confidence is it's not a power play, but it's again the ability to know what it is, what do we need, what are my needs here, and be confident in advocating for them. If we're unsure, or if we're coming from a place of kind of I'm making this conflict about this thing, but actually I don't really. It seems like I'm making a big thing about this. What's going on? Not we're kind of invisible to ourselves. Our motives are invisible to ourselves. Then we start to undermine trust in that relationship as well. And trust is so important in healthy conflict as well. To trust that, well, this person who's bringing up something to me, that they're bringing it up for the right reasons. They're not doing it because they're just trying to get more power in the relationship. They're not doing it because they're trying to punish me. They're doing it because I actually trust them that this is a problem for them and they wouldn't be making it into a thing it wasn't. And so I can kind of trust that. And that builds confidence as well, confidence in each other, confidence in each other's motive. And then celebrate agreement when it comes. Celebrate agreement when it comes. That we're not going to agree on everything. The things that we do agree on, let's bring those up to the fore as well. Because ultimately, what we normally want is we want to be right. We want to feel like, well, we're on the same page here. And in certain situations, that's not going to be possible. So let's celebrate the areas where we do agree. Because human beings, most of the time, again, we just want peace. We want to be at peace with each other. We want to feel like we're bonded and connected. We don't want to be getting into unnecessary conflict all the time. So yes, it's necessary to, at times, introduce conflict into relationships. That is healthy if done in a constructive way and done for the right reasons. And part of that is using the common ground as leverage at building the trust. Okay, we just have a few minutes, so I'm not going to take very long with these last two, but this is just a few basic tips in terms of if you are in a management position or if you are reporting to someone, a few things that you can do to build the trust. So relationships, of course, are huge for in terms of if you are in a management position, whether it's an executive position or with management, middle, lower management, interpersonal relationships are such an important part of how your success will be measured because you will get the best out of people if those relationships are healthy and the conflict is managed in a healthy way as well. So these are really, really important skills and a very self-interested way to say, well, let me culture start from the top, right? So let me introduce conflict management, a culture of conflict management here that is healthy. That's about it's about helpful resolution and not power dynamics. So I suppose this could be described with softer approach. So it's less about just results, but also about how do we manage people, how do we get the best out of people, how do we encourage transformative leadership, which is allowing people to grow in situations in their roles. How do we see the best? How do we understand when they're not performing what that might be, and it's not taking responsibility for their lack of performance, but helping them to perform more in a transformative way by providing a space for that. So as I said, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. There is a lot here that we can say about it. This transformative leadership style is sometimes called the emotional leadership style, and that doesn't mean led by emotions, but it's understanding that emotions are part of the human experience. And work is also a place where emotions exist, whether you would like that or not to be the case. We don't necessarily. It's not possible to completely leave those parts of ourselves at home, and in fact, there's an argument to be made for bringing an emotionally intelligent version of ourselves to work is really helpful as well. But being able to understand that, being able to understand other people's emotions as well, because you will see it with your colleagues as well, your subordinates, your superiors, that they are emotional beings as well. A lot of the time, they're not always acting in strictly rational ways. So being able to bring that awareness into these relationships is so important as well. Okay, I want to open it up for some questions in a minute. If you're dealing with superiors, and this is often a part where conflicts is avoided a lot, significantly. This is when we're dealing with our people who have our destiny in their hands, people who have power. This is something that's really, really important in terms of just job satisfaction, to be able to not necessarily be avoiding the conflict in those situations, knowing what you can do to manage conflict in a healthy way, because often the fear is, if I say what I don't like, I'm going to be labeled a troublemaker, I'm going to be labeled a difficult person. That's a real dynamic that's worth taking into consideration. But also, if we're able to manage these relationships effectively, it also increases our likelihood of progression and promotion. And this is the point about your emotional career success as well. So the interactions with your superior probably have a greater impact on success than the actual outcomes that you're delivering. Both are important, but that probably is going to have, the research indicates that's going to have a bigger impact. And it's not sustainable then just to prioritize the relationship. Yes, you have to prioritize the relationship, but you also have to take into consideration your own needs, because a career is a long time. And if you're not able to, again, advocate for yourself in a healthy way, then you're going to be overlooked, or people are not going to understand. And eventually you're going to act out or not perform, going to start burnout as well. It's important in conflict situations as well to be proactive. So invest in relationships. You can think about a relationship as a bank balance, right? It's got deposits of goodwill in it. And when we get into conflict situations, often what that'll do is it'll take withdrawals from the goodwill, right? It'll say, okay, well, this relationship is being tested a bit. Are there reserves that are there to allow it to happen? If we're on really shaky terms with someone, and maybe we're in debt in terms of goodwill, and then conflict comes up, that's often when conflict goes really badly, right? Because there's no good faith. So being able to invest in relationships with superiors, as well with subordinates, with colleagues, with personal relationships, invest in those relationships. So when the inevitable conflict comes, there is something to draw on there. There's trust and respect, goodwill that exists beforehand. Okay. So I know I raced through those last two because I just wanted to open it up for some questions now. Any thoughts? Any questions? We have a few minutes, so let me open up the floor. I'm gonna have a keep an eye on the chat. If you want to go on the mic, let me know and I'll unmute you. But if you want to put it in the chat, feel free to do that. We have a few minutes for those questions. Okay, so Julie, your question, what are some of the things you can do to stay calm when someone is trying to get an emotional response out of you? I mean, the first thing is I would challenge the premise of the question and say, don't be so sure that someone is trying to get an emotional response out of you. Sometimes we can personalize another person's behavior. So we can say, this person, they're really trying to provoke me. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Yes, sometimes people are deliberately trying to provoke us. Certainly that happens. But more often than not, I would suggest, and normally in most healthy relationships especially, and this you'll find there's more provocative behavior in unhealthy relationships by definition. But in most relationships, people are not actually trying to get an emotional response out of us. They're just trying to get their own needs met. They might not know what their needs are. So being able to step back from it a little bit and understand, okay, well, this person's come from a place that I don't quite understand, but maybe it's less about me and more about them. That already is going to help you bring some calmness to your response, because this feeling of this person is deliberately trying to get something out of me. How do you know, I'm going to give them what they want to. That is then, that's animating you, that's aggravating. But yes, let me take your question at face value and say, let's say someone is actually deliberately trying to get an emotional response out of you. I can't see that would happen. Um, I mean, firstly, it's about controlling what we can control, right? And if we are just reacting emotionally, well, then number one, we're giving them exactly what they want, which is making us powerless. And this is the paradox with anger often, is that when we feel powerless and small, we use anger as a way of making ourselves feel big and powerful. But what it actually does is if we're using anger as a way of making ourselves big, what it's actually doing is making us small, because we're just reacting to another person. We actually don't even have control over our own reactions, our own feelings. We're not even taking responsibility for those. We're just responding. And that makes us more powerless, right? And that's the spiral of a toxic anger response. So being able to say, okay, well, I am responsible for how I feel. I can take responsibility for my feelings. I'm allowed to feel certain ways. I get to choose what to do based on it. I get to behave in a certain way. That's that part of the framework. And then just, there are certain kind of basic behavioral interventions, such as saying, I actually can't have this conversation right now because I do feel like I'm feeling a type of emotional flooding that's not going to be helpful. So let's get back to this in 10 minutes, or let's talk about it tomorrow, or if it's a message or an email, just don't reply to it. Get some time to allow the emotions to recede a little bit, the logical parts of your brain to flood it, to come back in again. Deep breathing can be a helpful way of slowing down those responses as well. So as always, there's not a one size fits all response, but hopefully some of those things are relevant to your question, Julie. And how do you resolve a conflict when the other person doesn't recognize acknowledge the conflict and isn't willing to resolve or talk about it? Well, you can't resolve conflict if another person is willing to resolve it. Then that's conflicts and boundary setting is like tennis. We act, and then the ball's in their court, and how they respond, we then respond to that response. Even if it is a lack of response, then we have to make a choice about what does that mean for us. And if we're in a relationship where a person constantly refuses to resolve conflict, well, that tells us something about how healthy that relationship can be. It puts some limits on what that relationship could be. And that's important. And if it's a professional relationship, then sometimes we'll have to bring in third parties, right? We'll have to bring in HR or mediators or someone else if it's unsuccessful. So again, it's about just owning what we can own, controlling what we can control. We don't have to force another person to it. to the table, but also understand that they refuse to come to the table. We've given them the best opportunity to do that. Well, that tells us something about how our response should follow. David, thank you for the webinar. You're most welcome. When in a conflict situation, I struggle with stage fright in these situations and often end up saying something which escalates the conflict or forgetting to say what I actually needed or wanted to say. This is especially with superiors. How can I minimize that? So that's such a great question. You've described such a normal conflict response, and one that I can relate to as well. I'm sure a lot of people can. It's one thing to think about conflict theoretically, as I alluded to at the beginning of the webinar. It's another thing when we're in that situation and we are faced with the person in front of us, and we're feeling a lot of the feelings that are then coming up as a result. Some uncertainty, anxiety, panic, fear, anger, whatever it might be. All of these things are because we're often operating then from an emotional place. We're not going to be thinking in a very clear way. So our thinking is by definition more likely to be a bit more scattered and disorganized. There's no easy answer for that. The basic answer is practice. So the more we avoid conflict, the more that stage fright increases when we are in conflict situations. The more we're open to conflict, the more we are able to perform under those more emotional conditions. And practicing in the safer relationships with saying the things we need to say, even if it's a bit uncomfortable, that's a practice for when we're in the really high stakes conflict situation, and we're kind of going at it with the superior, for example. Those skills are transferable. So practicing is a big way of it. Just being able to slow it down, to be grounded, to be mindful, to practice deep breathing in those moments, just to, again, pausing is so important as well. And being able to just, if the conflict allows ourselves, just to be able to be very careful about the words that we are using. But I guess the overall answer there is it's normal practice, expected to happen, expected to be part of conflict. Don't judge yourself for it, because then you have an extra layer of judgment and anxiety on top of it. See yourself as a human being. Humans typically have evolved to not like conflict, so that's a very normal response. But that doesn't have to be the end of the conversation process. Hope that addresses your question, David. That's the questions that come through. I'll try to race through them because we're out of time. Almost out of time, I should say. So, Linda, the approach one can have to take to show you are with more than what you currently get. The approach one have to take to show. Linda, I'm not getting that question. Do you mind just typing it again? I think I'm missing a word there. That's probably because I'm rushing as well. It's just not quite making sense. I'm going to look out for it if you wouldn't mind typing it again. As a manager, how can you be firm but yet approachable at the same time, whereby employees feel free to approach them when they're the limits? Yeah, not easy to do. That question there, I'm not sure who it's from. That. So that's not easy to do, but I think it's about being mindful as well, and healthy boundaries, which are knowing what the roles are, knowing where the limits are, entering those interactions in a mindful way, which is say, I want to be firm, but I also don't want to give the impression that this relationship is not a professional one. That I think that just comes through communication and meta conversations, or conversations about conversations. So we talk about the communication, so we can actually talk about these things and bring them out the open. Say, I will be there for you, but also expect me to play the role of a manager here, not of a friend. We can have conversations about those just to keep everyone on the same page and to manage those expectations. But it starts with you just being aware of what those expectations are, I would think, expectations of yourself and what feels appropriate. And Paul saying, most of the time I avoid conflict work situations. You're not alone with that. That's very common. If you notice it escalates more, it often does. And this is part of the skill of conflict management, is knowing what's likely to escalate and what is likely not to. And the things that aren't going to escalate, once off, we are within our rights to let them go. That's not a sign of cowardice. That's a sign of often courage. So this doesn't matter, I'm letting go. Whereas knowing over time, we start to realize this thing is going to become an issue. Let me speak about it before it does. That's helpful. Cynthia, conflict is a part of life, and knowing strategies from the topic can really help keep your home and workplace healthy. Couldn't agree more. Well said. Elsie, also related to David's question, again, such a common experience, that one. I know we're over time. I'm happy to go a few minutes if you guys are still available. I can only think of what I've said after the situation's passed. Yeah, and often we ruminate and don't get off. So you kind of think, if only I'd said that, and only I'd said that. That's also a very normal process. And again, practice helps us to become better at it. We're never going to be perfect. That's conflict and say everything we should have said. Thank you, David. Thank you, Maria. Ben, thank you so much. Okay, I think that's everybody. Guys, thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. Very much enjoyed the chat, and yeah, we will pick it up again towards the end of November with our next webinar. So thank you. I hope that you have constructive conflict in your life, but just the right amount, not too much, not too little. Keep practicing. I will see you all in November. Thank you so much.